Well, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's visit to South Africa is part of Washington's charm offensive in Africa. The Biden administration has been hard at work rebuilding relations with Africa following the Trump years. To further discuss this visit and what it means for diplomatic and economic cooperation, we are now joined via Zoom by Professor Chris Isike, a regular guest here on SA Today. Prof, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. A very good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon, and thank you again for having me.
You're most welcome. Let's talk about then the importance of this visit for both countries. And is it an equal, relationship? We're always being told that it's, a cooperative relationship. It's a balanced relationship. But in reality, is that the truth? I mean, some people have kind of viewed this sudden interest in Africa, in South Africa, with a bit of suspicion. Should we do so?
Well, yes, viewing the renewed interest in Africa by the U.S. with suspicion is in order, because remember that after the Cold War, the United States abandoned Africa, left it to its own devices, and then the gap that they left behind is what countries like China have been filling up, and right now they've awoken to that mistake, and they're trying to correct it. But in terms of whether this is a relationship of equal partnership as espoused in their U.S.-Africa policy of 2022 remains to be seen. There is still talk about, disrespect for Africa. For example, in terms of the fact that the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in December did not have a clear-cut agenda that was early on communicated to African leaders. So many saw it as a jamboree, even though at the end of that meeting, we saw commitments from the U.S. to the tune of about $55 billion to Africa. And I think that the visit by the Treasury Secretary Yellen is a follow-up of the commitments made in December.
Yeah. Yellen has already been to Senegal as well as Zambia before coming to South Africa. I don't imagine that the interests of the U.S. are exactly the same in either of the countries. What do you imagine are the different sort of interests in those particular countries, and why those three countries in particular with the U.S. have been showing this particular interest?
Well, you are correct that in the long term, it won't benefit us much because these are small countries, the US or even China or Russia, for that matter, can cherry pick us and deal with them individually and advance their interests while pretending to be advancing the continent's interests. But, and this is what I've said before, that what will serve us better is for us to, come together, form an Africa-US policy that will guide how the continent as a whole, maybe through the African Union Commission, will engage with these superpowers that are, contesting for all kinds of opportunities and resources and favors in the continent right now. But, in Zambia, that she went there. I think the whole purpose is to try and communicate that there are different options that are available to Africa in terms of getting help from powerful country. Zambia is a very good story of how democracy can work, and it's also being used as a test point to showcase this arrangement that the G20 put in place for a common framework for dealing with the debt over indebtedness of countries that are heavily indebted, and then she had to go to Senegal. Senegal currently is the chair of the African Union, and so that was important. And South Africa is also a very important player. There is none of them that will come to Africa without at least touching base with South Africa, given its geostrategic position, and of course the relationship that exists between South Africa and the United States.
Is there any relevance to the fact that the US and China do have some known tensions, and that perhaps the US could be, I'd use the word, threatened by any sort of relationship between Africa and China, specifically South Africa and China, and the fact that the Chinese have sort of this economic footprint on a big footprint really on the African continent? Could that be the US's way of making some sort of headway that China has already made?
Well, yes. Africa is considered as a region, is the world's eighth largest economy. And by 2063, Africa is aiming to become the world's third largest economy in the world. So, put differently, that would mean, growing to be the world's Japan right now. And that will put the continent ahead of the likes of Germany, India, France, and the United Kingdom in terms of economic might. So if you add our heavy youth population and abundant material resources, you can understand why the continent is a tough for superpower interest and rivalry. So yes, China's increasing footprint in Africa does worry the US, and it partly explains why they are putting everything in place to try and renew engagement with the continent.
All right. And then, this is a very important question when it comes to the issue of, South Africa's stance when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And of course, as you know, South Africa not, speaking out exactly when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, kind of taking a neutral position in that. And one would also think about the fact that South Africa is part of BRICS, not being so vocal. This sort of dynamic, what does it mean for South Africa-US relations, obviously knowing where the US stands when it comes to this particular conflict? And would there be some kind of coercion, for South Africa to pick a side? And it seems that South Africa said, actually, we won't. But would there be some kind of talk in terms of that situation?
Look, two things. One, I think it's South Africa is already taking a stand. The stance South Africa is taking is that we believe, multilateralism and dialogue is a pathway to peacefully resolving the conflict. That is a stand. It doesn't have to say, I support Russia or I support the US for it to be recognized as a stand. The fact that it says we support dialogue is a stand. And this is rooted in the African Union's principle of multilateralism as a way of resolving a conflict peacefully. So that in itself is a stand. In terms of whether there will be repercussions for South Africa or some kind of coercion. Well, South Africa has been bullied previously, by superpowers like China in the past. And when you look at the case of how the Dalai Lama issue played out with, in terms of allying to come to South Africa. But South Africa, I think, since then has grown, and it recognizes that it has agency. The US, in its policy towards Africa, stated quite clearly, and we can hold them to that they recognize Africa's agency contributing to solving world's problems. And this came from how Africa voted during the UNGA meeting in March of 2022 to try and condemn Russia. Yeah. I think the world then recognized that Africa has the best voting bloc in the UN General Assembly. So I don't think that there will be bullying. They actually need us more than we do need them. So everyone is going to be careful.
All right. Prof, it's always a pleasure having you on the show, and we certainly always appreciate your input here on SA Today. Prof. Chris Isike there.